All righty, let's get started. My name is David Lewis. I'm here with my colleague, Mitch Browne. We are with 80/20 Consulting, based here in Southern California. Today's topic is cash flow forecasting. And our view as a firm is that this is something that it's almost impossible to pay too much attention to, especially in the current economic, financing, lending, and capital environment, not to mention the more than modest amount of uncertainty about future economic prospects. Although we're optimists in our company, but still good to be prepared. So Mitch Browne, just a brief background on Mitch. He's an MBA from Washington. He has a very nice blend of corporate and investment banking and securities background. He worked at Wells Fargo Securities as an analyst and associate in investment banking. He worked at Yahoo as a senior financial analyst in the corporate finance area. He worked at Hulu as a finance manager there. And at AECOM, which is now about a $20 billion global engineering services firm. He has experience in sell-side investment banking, buy-side corporate development, and corporate financial planning and analysis. So he's an excellent authority on the subject of forecasting in general and cash flow forecasting as well. He's been with the company, our company, for a number of years, and many of his projects have been around forecasting capital requirements for emerging growth and technology companies, and also doing transaction support on the sell side, in which cash flow forecasting was an important part of determining the working capital peg, which is a key point of negotiation in M&A transactions. So Mitch, welcome to our remote virtual world. So
thank you, David.
To have you. Always good to see you. So I think the first question people might be asking is, what might be wrong or deficient with the way that we're doing cash flow forecasting and reporting today versus what might be going on in the environment and what I should be doing?
Good question. I think there's two main reasons we might think of it differently now than we would have a couple of months ago. I think traditionally companies consistently look at the P&L performance. They sometimes look at their balance sheet, and they only occasionally look at cash. And as a result, many companies have cash forecasts that are essentially afterthoughts or backed into type of calculations. And we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by cash flow forecasts at 80/20. But the other way it is significantly different today is that forecasts we built only 8-10 weeks ago likely didn't incorporate all of the variables and toggles that we would consider today. So what I mean by that is there are certain things that companies are reacting to today, whether it's decline in sales or trying to control costs. There are things that we would want to plan for and assume that we just wouldn't have taken into consideration a couple of months ago.
Okay, all right. So Mitch, I've heard you say a lot about the fact that if a company hasn't done this already, the change in economic circumstances, that most companies should be rebuilding their cash flow forecasts from the ground up. Why is that, and what does that mean exactly?
Sure. In terms of what it means, and this is vary from what people might traditionally do with annual planning, is when we talk about our cash flow planning, it's at a weekly level, and it is starting at the bottoms up. So instead of taking prior periods and adding a percentage or taking away a percentage, we're going to go at the most granular level and build up expected cash receipts and disbursements. And so that can be large items like rent and payroll, and understanding exactly when they're going to come out of our bank accounts, and also future events for expected expenses that we maybe didn't really think about, whether it's annual maintenance of some assets, whether it's some sort of cash payments for taxes, things like this that in general, when you're planning at a bigger scale, either a quarter or annual view, you may not really care when those values are going to hit. What we're talking about is a bottoms-up analysis that lets you know what your anticipated cash balance is going to be every given week.
Okay. And why do you think that's important now?
Well, simply, it's important because you don't want to run out of cash, and this is a consideration that is a reality for some companies all the time, but for many companies, this might be their first time, or at least first time in maybe a decade, where they're looking at cash balances and they really want to know, where is that turning point? Where are they going to need to ensure that they have additional financing lined up? And additionally to that, and we've encountered this with our small startup or high growth companies, it also can inform when you want to raise money. You don't want to raise too much money and over dilute existing shareholders. And so whether it's trying to conserve cash or trying simply just to know when your next round of financing is necessary and how much, those are both valid reasons that a company would want to revisit or create a cash flow forecast.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And I know that particularly in Los Angeles, there's a very large number of companies that are venture capital backed that have, they may have paths to profitability, but the path may run out a few years into the future. And so in a different kind of a funding environment, they might need to shift gears in terms of their burn rates and maybe getting to profitability, or at least cash flow break even much more quickly, which could necessitate some dramatic changes to the enterprise or a change in their business model. What kinds of companies would you say are good candidates for this type of forecast?
Well, I mean, really, it's anyone who's maybe in this era looking at cash a lot harder and looking at cash balances maybe for the first time. And it can be tempting to look at your traditional forecasts and traditional P&Ls and do a proxy for cash, but it really doesn't give you that same level of certainty. And I think going through the exercise of a bottoms-up comprehensive cash flow forecast, what it can do is really expose the drivers of your cost on a true cash basis, as opposed to a P&L, which one can exclude some cash costs for whatever reasons. And it also really articulates what level of investment is required. So instead of spreading investments over a longer period via depreciation, you're actually saying, oh, I need to go spend $1 million on this physical item or this piece of software, and seeing where those bumps are and understanding which of those things are truly necessary. Maybe they can be pushed out or delayed or spread out over a longer period of time. And similarly, you can think about headcount hiring as well. So companies that, like you said, smaller or high growth companies may have had a certain path to profitability. If they know they're going to need to make that cash last a little longer, they may need to revisit some of the things they're planning to do in the rest of the year. Okay,
that makes sense. That's a good point. In terms of making fixed asset investments or other things that get amortized over time, they may not look that consequential if you take them over their useful life and you're just recognizing the expense every month. It can be a very significant cash outflow at a time when a company should be looking at cash. I believe it's true that there are some very unusual things about the suddenness of the change in economic circumstances and how it's impacting companies operationally, and things that you would typically have extrapolated from an EBITDA forecast into a cash flow forecast today. There are risk areas. There may be opportunity areas, but there's certainly risk areas on the cash flow forecast that probably people were not thinking about 2 or 3 months ago. And you mentioned earlier in our discussion about some of the toggles and scenario analysis input areas you'd like to have today that you might not have thought seriously about 3 or 4 months ago. Can you talk a little bit about what those are?
Sure. There are some of the bigger picture items. So maybe you were thinking about expanding your footprint real estate wise or making new hires. Those are sort of the easier ones to wrap your head around. Those are maybe areas you want to weight or reduce. A few of the areas that would be considered today that never would cross one's mind perhaps 8 or 9 weeks ago would be things like furloughs or leaves of absence, or having salary reductions, across the board type of reductions. Even some relatively smaller things, but that no one may have thought of, 401k matching contributions, smaller areas of G&A overhead that in most traditional or typical budgeting processes don't even come up as a option to toggle.
Mm-hmm. That one makes sense. What about, how do you integrate deterioration in credit quality of your buyers? Because your customers, I've thought about that for our clients where,
Yeah.
you know, where certain sectors in particular, but can you talk a little bit about that and how you build that into your cash flow forecast?
Yeah, that's a great point. Really, in addition to the expense side, which does get a lot of the focus, is the receivables and collectibles. And so understanding this is part of a cash flow forecast. We go at the creditor level and looking at each amount owed to the company and owed out, and be able to evaluate the likelihood of collecting. And maybe you need to revisit historical assumptions around bad debt. So if historically it was 3%, is that still a reasonable assumption? And really going account by account to understand the risk associated with each. And the last thing you want to do is build out this cash flow forecast, assuming everything's perfectly collected, and realize you haven't really had a comprehensive approach, and your data is not accurate because you're not going to collect the way you assumed you would have 8 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. In the so it could either be that you have business failures that are actually causing your write-offs to go up significantly. I mean, by orders of magnitude. And the other is just that the stretching out of payments, which obviously can have an impact on cash, so that all of a sudden you are, if you don't have a revolving credit facility in place, now is not the best time to be going out and looking for one. But I know that a lot of companies are drawing their facilities down, so they have cash. And part of which might be needed because even if their customers are paying them, they might be stretching out the payment terms beyond plan. So I think that makes sense. Anything else in terms of thinking about, I guess, what the benefits are of doing this exercise? Most of our people in finance, the CFOs and others that we know, generally are always trying to do more work than they really have the capacity to do, because most companies don't exactly overinvest in the size of the accounting and finance team. So if somebody is wondering what the benefits of doing this are versus the more urgent compliance and reporting and control requirements they have, what would you tell them about why this is a worthwhile exercise to do?
This is a good question. I think everything gets viewed with a certain level of urgency, and that's only increased, I think, over the last couple of months. I would say if you're asking me to defend a cash flow forecast, it's that it is probably the core analysis. You think about what is the thing that keeps the light on is cash, right? At the end of the day, that's going to be as important, and I'd say probably more important than any sort of traditional forecast or view on a prior period. Both of those are great to have, but you really do want to have a very certain idea of how long your cash is going to last and what your capital needs are. So obviously it's a little self-promotional, but I'd say put it at the top of the list.
Yeah, I agree. It is self-promotional, but I think you're also right about that. Thank you. Somebody once told me a long time ago, they said the #1 rule in business is never run out of cash, which probably sounds obvious, but what I have found that, first of all, we know you can grow yourself right out of business if you're not properly capitalized and financed. The second thing is that, particularly in the middle market to lower middle market, I think many companies don't realize that you don't want to wait till the last minute to find out that you need to go raise more cash, because by that time, there are all kinds of bad things that can happen, including ending up losing operating or equity control of your enterprise to your lenders, for example. So it's important to identify points in the future when cash might be at a premium well ahead of time. That's one thing. The other thing I would say is that one of the greatest gifts a CEO or CFO can have or give is the gift of peace of mind. And so, I know that when we headed into this, one of the first things we did as a firm was build a very robust cash flow forecast. And so that even though we don't know with certainty how the economy is going to perform over the rest of the year or how our business will perform, we're quite confident we have a very long runway to operate, pivot the company if and as necessary, and adjust the size of the enterprise if we need to do that. So it gave us the mental space to take the time to plan deliberately and let things play out. So we were in a position from a financing cash perspective that we didn't need to make any rash, deep, or dramatic cuts in the organization. So that was good for us. And I think any company should have that, because it tells you what if you have a 1-year planning or 5-year planning horizon, but you've got 6 months of cash, that doesn't work very well. So I just think it's a responsible thing. So I think that every company, in the same way that one of the analogies you gave me, I know that you did a long project for a client of ours in the electric vehicle space, is that, knowing exactly how much charge is left in your battery and how many miles it will get you is a lot better than wondering with some degree of imprecision. And I think the same thing is true for an organization with regard to cash. So Mitch, I want to thank you for, did you want to add something else?
I just wanted to add on to that, and you made a comment, and it's worth pointing out or re-highlighting, is that getting this as early as possible is always better. Similar to the car example you just said. You want to know the news as early as possible, because the longer you wait, the fewer options you have. And so if you find out you have 1 week of cash left, there's very little you can do, and your hands are going to be very forced as to what your possible remedies and actions are. The earlier you can find out that there is a potential crunch or problem, it gives you a lot more greater flexibility to make decisions that are good for the company long run versus having to make last minute drastic measures.
That is correct. Well, thank you, Mitch. As always, it's a pleasure to spend time with you. I hope that anybody watching this found it useful and riveting, in fact. And with that, we'll wish all of our listeners and watchers a great afternoon, evening, or whatever the case may be. Thank you, Mitch.
Thanks, David.